Comrades, let us begin with a truth so stark that once spoken, it cannot be unheard. The systems that surround you, those you serve, those you obey, those you struggle within were never designed for your liberation. They were engineered to shape you, discipline you, and ultimately convert you into instruments of profit. You live inside a machinery that did not arise by accident. It was built, piece by piece, by those who benefit from your labor while denying you the fullness of your humanity. For centuries, the ruling class has cultivated the illusion that society functions naturally, that exploitation is destiny, that inequality is the product of nature rather than history. But history, as I have argued again and again, is not an eternal chain of inevitabilities. It is the unfolding struggle between those who produce everything and those who own everything. History is class struggle. And today, the struggle is concealed beneath layers of technology, bureaucracy, and ideology that mask domination as efficiency, obedience as duty, and exploitation as progress. Look around you. Machines hum, screens glow, systems automate, and institutions regulate. But beneath every process, every algorithm, every corporate structure, lies the same old relation, the extraction of human labor for the enrichment of a minority. The worker becomes an appendage of the machine, a living tool whose hands, time, and thoughts are bent to the imperatives of capital. What I once described in the factories of the 19th century has been perfected on a massive scale, alienation so deep that many no longer recognize it. You are alienated from the product of your labor, for it is taken from you. You are alienated from the act of labor, for it is dictated to you. You are alienated from your fellow workers, for the system pits you against one another. And you are alienated from yourself, for you are denied the freedom to shape your own life. This machinery of control, political, economic, cultural, functions best when you believe you are powerless, isolated, and replaceable. Capital grows by reducing living humans to interchangeable parts. The system survives only as long as the worker forgets their own centrality to it. But understand this, the machine does not run without you. The wealth of nations does not emerge from the minds of the wealthy, but from the hands of the workers. The power of the ruling class is nothing more than the power you have not yet reclaimed. Comrades, the purpose of every ruling class throughout history has been to disguise its interests as universal truths. They tell you that competition is human nature when cooperation built civilizations. They tell you inequality is inevitable when it is their laws, their institutions, their private property that create it. They tell you the system is too complex to change when they are the ones who designed it. Capitalism has not only seized the tools of labor, it has seized the imagination. It has convinced millions that no alternative is possible. But alternatives are not discovered. They are created through collective consciousness and unified action. Revolutions are born not when the oppressed learn they are strong, but when they learn the oppressor is weak. The bourgeoisie depends on your obedience, your silence, your exhaustion. That is why they fragment you into categories, industries, and identities, keeping you too scattered to recognize yourselves as a class with shared interests. That is why they flood you with the ideology of individual struggle, so that you blame yourself for the consequences of a system designed to fail you. But once workers understand their collective position, once they see that their exploitation is not personal misfortune but a structural necessity of capital, the facade of inevitability shatters. Class consciousness is the first crack in the machinery. Organization is the second. Solidarity is the third. And with each crack, the gears of domination tremble. Comrades, emancipation is not granted, it is forged. The ruling class will never voluntarily dismantle the structures that elevate them. But you, the workers, the dispossessed, the exploited, you possess the one force capable of reshaping the world. Your unity. When workers stand alone, they are tools. When they stand together, they are a force of history. Breaking free does not begin in the halls of power, it begins in the mind. It begins with the recognition that systems are not natural, that exploitation is not destiny, that power does not descend from above, but rises from below. Once consciousness awakens, the machinery of control loses its spell. Once solidarity forms, the gears of exploitation grind to a halt. Once workers organize, the very foundations of the old world shake. The question, comrades, is not whether the world can change, it always has. The question is whether the workers who give life to society will finally claim the life that belongs to them, whether they will continue as tools of another's wealth or rise as creators of a new social order. The machinery that turns humans into instruments of profit can be dismantled. The power that exploits the many for the comfort of the few can be overturned. The systems that shape your lives can be reshaped by your collective will. Comrades, the world is not waiting to be interpreted, it is waiting to be transformed. Capitalist systems reduce human beings to tools for profit because within the structure of wage labor, every aspect of human existence is subordinated to the demands of accumulation, efficiency, and the relentless pursuit of surplus value. In this arrangement, the worker is not valued for their creativity, dignity, or human potential, but for their capacity to generate profit for those who own the means of production. The system measures human worth by productivity, by speed, by obedience to the rhythms of capital, rather than by any inner quality of the individual. What emerges is a society where human life is instrumentalized, where the worker becomes an expendable component, where labor power is bought and sold like any other commodity. The worker's hands, voice, energy, and even emotional endurance become assets controlled by employers who dictate the terms of their use. The moment profit is no longer extracted from a particular worker, that worker is discarded, replaced, or automated, revealing that the system's loyalty is never to people, but to capital itself. In capitalism, labor is not the expression of a person's essence, but a market transaction in which the employer purchases time rather than talent, control rather than partnership. The laborer's day is segmented into hours, each hour assigned a price that rarely reflects the true value produced. The majority of what the worker creates is appropriated by the owner, who gains wealth not through personal labor, but through command over the labor of others. This dynamic transforms production into a site of exploitation, not cooperation, and the worker into a mechanism for generating surplus. Even the worker's physical movements are shaped to fit the logic of the process. Machines dictate pace, supervisors enforce discipline, algorithms measure performance, and all of these forces channel the worker's actions toward the single goal of expanding capital. The individual's capacities, aspirations, and frustrations are irrelevant to the system unless they affect productivity. Beyond the workplace, the worker is conditioned to adapt to this role of an instrument. Education trains individuals not to question the system, but to fit into it. Social norms praise hard work while ignoring who benefits from that work. Cultural narratives celebrate the entrepreneur and the owner while rendering invisible the labor that sustains them. Through ideology, capitalism convinces workers that their position is natural, inevitable, or even virtuous. This ideological machinery reinforces the idea that one's value lies in one's usefulness to capital, not in one's humanity. The worker begins to internalize the logic of the system, evaluating their self-worth by their output, by their ability to meet quotas, by the approval of employers, by the salary assigned to their labor, which itself is determined by market forces rather than human needs. At the same time, capitalism fosters a pervasive sense of competition among workers, pushing them to view one another not as comrades or collaborators, but as rivals for wages, positions, and survival. This competition fragments the working class, preventing unity and perpetuating isolation. In this isolation, the worker becomes even more vulnerable to exploitation. The pressure to maintain employment compels workers to accept conditions that diminish their autonomy, health, and spirit. Thus, the system does not merely use bodies, it shapes minds. It molds the worker into an obedient tool who feels grateful for exploitation because the alternative is unemployment, poverty, or starvation. Fear becomes a subtle but powerful method of control. The threat of replacement, mechanization, or outsourcing pushes workers to tolerate indignities they would otherwise reject. Over time, the worker becomes alienated from the product of their labor, from the act of production, from their fellow workers, and ultimately from their own human nature. They cannot recognize themselves in what they create because the product belongs to someone else. They cannot shape the process of production because it is dictated solely by the needs of capital. They cannot form genuine solidarity with others because the system pits them against one another. And they cannot fully develop as human beings because so much of their energy is spent simply reproducing the conditions of their existence within a system that drains more than it returns. In this way, capitalism not only reduces humans to tools, but reshapes humanity itself to fit the narrow imperatives of accumulation, turning potential into exhaustion, cooperation into competition, and creativity into mechanical repetition. Alienation disconnects workers from their labor, their fellow workers, and themselves because the capitalist mode of production severs the natural unity between human beings and the activity through which they shape the world. When a worker enters the workplace, they encounter a process that is not theirs, a rhythm they do not control, and a purpose determined entirely by the owners of capital. Labor becomes something external, a means of survival rather than an expression of human creativity or self-realization. Instead of labor being a fulfilling activity through which individuals see their intentions materialized, it becomes a burden imposed from the outside, an obligation performed under compulsion, and a sacrifice of life hours exchanged for wages that rarely reflect the value produced. The worker cannot identify with the product of their labor because it belongs to someone else. It is taken away, commodified, and sold for profit. This separation between the worker and their product creates a profound disconnection. For the worker sees their own energy, skill, and time embodied in objects that enrich others, while leaving them with only enough to reproduce their labor power for the next day. This alienation extends into the act of labor itself. The worker's activity is directed not by their own purpose, but by the demands of capital, which determines the pace, structure, and goals of production. Labor becomes mechanical, repetitive, and devoid of intrinsic meaning. Instead of shaping the process, the worker is shaped by it. They are subordinated to machines, to supervisors, to timers and targets, to strict hierarchies that reduce their autonomy and transform their movements into regulated motions dictated by profitability. Through this, the worker becomes estranged from the very activity that should affirm their human capacities. The more intensely they labor, the more drained they become, and the less they see themselves in the process. Labor, which should be a vital expression of human life, becomes an exhausting necessity alien to the worker's own desires, inclinations, and identity. Alienation also manifests in the social relations between workers themselves. Because capitalism operates on competition, efficiency, and individual advancement, it undermines the natural bonds of solidarity that should develop within a community of workers. Instead of recognizing each other as allies in a collective struggle, workers are pitted against one another for jobs, promotions, or survival. This competition fragments the working class and erodes the possibility of genuine cooperation. Each worker becomes a potential threat to another's livelihood, and this manufactured rivalry obscures their shared exploitation. Suspicion replaces trust, and isolation replaces camaraderie. Even within the same workplace, workers may find themselves disconnected, each performing specialized tasks that prevent them from seeing the larger picture of their collective contribution. The division of labor, which intensifies with the development of industry, deepens this separation by turning individuals into specialists confined to narrow roles, unable to grasp the full nature of their work or its relation to others. The final and most devastating form of alienation occurs within the worker's relationship to themselves. Human beings possess the capacity to imagine, create, and purposefully transform their environment. In labor, they should experience their own powers as active forces. But when labor is external, coerced, and controlled by capital, the worker becomes estranged from their own human essence. They begin to view themselves not as autonomous individuals with creative potential, but as instruments of production, defined by their usefulness to the system. Their identity becomes tied to their job title, their productivity, their wage, rather than their deeper qualities or aspirations. This internal alienation produces feelings of worthlessness, fatigue, and emotional numbness. For the worker experiences each day not as an unfolding of their capacities, but as a draining repetition that leaves little room for personal growth or fulfillment. The more they labor under these conditions, the further they drift from their own sense of purpose, becoming strangers to their own thoughts, desires, and potential. Alienation thus permeates every dimension of the worker's existence, creating a life in which the product they create does not belong to them. The activity they perform is controlled by others, the people around them are cast as competitors, and their own human capacities feel distant and diminished. Class struggle is the driving force behind all social and historical change because every society, from ancient civilizations to modern capitalist nations, has been shaped by conflicts between those who possess power and resources and those whose labor sustains them. These opposing groups do not merely differ in wealth, they occupy fundamentally different positions in the structure of production with incompatible interests that inevitably lead to tension. History is not a harmonious progression of ideas or a peaceful evolution of institutions. It is the record of confrontations between classes whose needs and aspirations cannot be reconciled within the existing order. When one class seeks to preserve its dominance and another seeks to transcend its oppression, the resulting struggle becomes the engine through which societies transform, dissolve, and give birth to new forms. In every epoch, the ruling class defines the political, cultural, and legal institutions that maintain its dominance. The structure of the state, the moral values promoted in schools, the stories societies tell themselves, all reflect the interests of those who own and control the means of production. These ideas appear natural, eternal, or even divine, but they are rooted in material relations that privilege one class at the expense of another. The oppressed, however, do not passively accept these conditions. Whether as slaves resisting bondage, serfs rebelling against feudal lords, or workers challenging the power of capital, subordinate classes push back against the constraints imposed upon them. Their resistance exposes the contradictions within the system, revealing the gap between the ruling class's claims and the lived reality of the majority. Class struggle intensifies whenever existing relations of production hinder further development of society's productive forces. When new technologies, new forms of labor, or new economic possibilities emerge that the old order cannot contain, conflict sharpens. Feudalism collapsed when its rigid hierarchies could no longer accommodate expanding trade, urban economies, and the early forms of capitalist production. The bourgeoisie rose to power not because it presented a moral argument, but because its economic strength eventually surpassed that of the feudal aristocracy. Their struggle overturned the old institutions and established new ones designed to support capitalist accumulation. What appeared as a political revolution was in fact the culmination of a deeper, long-standing economic conflict. In the modern era, the struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat becomes the central contradiction shaping society. Capitalism generates unprecedented wealth, but it does so by extracting surplus value from the labor of workers who own nothing but their labor power. The more productive society becomes, the more intensely workers feel the weight of exploitation, for technological progress often strengthens capital's dominance rather than relieving the burden on labor. Workers are forced to compete for employment, to accept conditions dictated by capital, and to endure cycles of instability caused by crises inherent in the system. These crises, periodic and destructive, reveal that the capitalist class, despite its claims to stewardship, cannot control the forces it unleashes. Overproduction, unemployment, and inequality expose the contradictions between socialized production and private appropriation. Class struggle also manifests in everyday life, not only in dramatic confrontations or organized movements. It appears in wage disputes, in struggles over working hours, in fights for housing, healthcare, and dignity. Every reform won by workers is a testament to their resistance, for the ruling class grants nothing that threatens its interests unless compelled. The history of labor rights, democratic participation, and social welfare programs is a history of battles waged by workers to secure conditions that capitalism would never have granted voluntarily. These victories, however, do not eliminate the underlying conflict. They simply modify the terrain on which the struggle continues. As class consciousness develops, workers begin to see their experiences not as isolated hardships but as part of a broader system of exploitation. They recognize that their struggles are shared with millions who face the same pressures, the same insecurity, the same denial of control over their lives. This awareness transforms scattered grievances into collective power. Once workers understand themselves as a class, their opposition to the ruling class becomes explicit rather than implicit, organized rather than spontaneous. At this stage, the struggle is no longer confined to economic demands. It becomes political, challenging the institutions that uphold the dominant class's power. Throughout history, ruling classes have attempted to suppress, obscure, or redirect class struggle, but they cannot eliminate its roots. As long as society is divided into classes with opposing interests, conflict will persist, shaping institutions and driving change. The abolition of old property relations and the creation of new social forms arise not from the benevolence of the powerful, but from the pressure exerted by those whose labor sustains the entire structure. The development of human history is inseparable from these struggles, for only through them do societies break free from outdated systems and move toward new possibilities. Collective consciousness and worker unity are the first cracks in the machinery of control, because the power of any exploitative system depends on the ignorance, isolation, and fragmentation of those it dominates. Capitalism maintains its authority not simply through ownership of factories, technology, or institutions, but through the shaping of ideas and the cultivation of a mindset in which workers see themselves as individuals rather than as a class with shared interests. As long as each worker views their struggle as personal misfortune instead of structural exploitation, the machinery of control remains unchallenged. But the moment workers begin to understand their exploitation as a collective condition produced by the system itself, a profound shift occurs. What was once experienced as private suffering becomes recognized as a universal pattern, and this recognition becomes the seed of class consciousness. With it, the ideological facade that presents capitalist relations as natural and unchangeable begins to fracture. This awakening dismantles the illusion that the problems faced by workers, low wages, long hours, insecurity, alienation, are the result of individual failure. Workers begin to see that these hardships arise not from personal inadequacy, but from a system that prioritizes profit over human dignity. When workers connect their individual experiences to a broader social context, they realize that their struggles mirror the struggles of millions of others. This shared understanding undermines the isolation that capitalism depends on, replacing competition with solidarity and resignation with awareness. Collective consciousness reveals the true nature of power, that a minority controls the material conditions of society only because the majority remains divided. Once this division begins to erode, the authority of capital weakens. Worker unity builds on this consciousness by transforming awareness into action. Unity does not arise automatically. It must be forged in workplaces, communities, and social movements where workers discover their collective strength. In capitalist society, the ruling class deliberately fosters division through hierarchies, wage differentials, competitive evaluations, and cultural narratives that emphasize individualism to prevent such unity from forming. Yet, despite these efforts, the conditions of exploitation themselves push workers toward collaboration. When workers recognize that they share the same adversary and the same conditions, unity becomes not merely desirable but necessary. Through unity, workers gain the power to halt production, demand rights, reshape institutions, and challenge the authority of those who depend on their labor. The machinery of control relies heavily on coercion disguised as normality, on the persistent reinforcement of the belief that nothing can be changed. But unified workers expose the fragility of this illusion. A single worker can be replaced, ignored, or silenced. A unified working class cannot. Unity transforms the worker from an isolated tool into part of a collective force capable of influencing the economic and political foundations of society. This unity begins in small acts of solidarity, a shared complaint, a collective refusal, a mutual defense, and grows into organized movements that confront the ruling class's power directly. Every instance of cooperation among workers weakens the ideological chains that capitalism uses to bind them. Collective consciousness also challenges the dominant cultural and ideological systems that justify exploitation. When workers begin questioning the narratives that portray capitalism as natural, meritocratic, or eternal, those narratives lose their grip. Critical thinking spreads, and the institutions that rely on obedience, corporations, governments, media, educational systems, face skepticism rather than passive acceptance. Workers begin demanding to know why wealth accumulates for a few while the many struggle to survive, why decisions about production are made by owners who never touch the labor they profit from, why society functions to enrich those who contribute the least. Questions like these destabilize the ideological foundation of capitalism, revealing its contradictions to those it exploits. In this process, unity becomes more than a strategic tool. It becomes a transformation of identity. The worker no longer sees themselves as an individual competing for survival, but as part of a collective body capable of reshaping the world. This shift in identity is one of the most profound cracks in the machinery of control because it allows workers to reclaim their agency from the system that has reduced them to instruments of profit. Once workers see themselves as historical actors rather than passive subjects, the entire structure of dominance begins to weaken. The ruling class recognizes the danger of this unity, which is why it invests so heavily in systems that fragment workers and suppress collective organization. But despite these efforts, the material realities of exploitation continually push workers toward shared understanding and collective action. No amount of ideological manipulation can permanently conceal the truth of lived experience. As workers awaken to their power, as they unite to challenge the conditions imposed upon them, the first cracks appear in the machinery that seeks to control their lives. These cracks widen with each act of solidarity, each shared realization, each step toward collective struggle, until the structures of domination can no longer hold under the pressure of an awakened and unified working class. Only organized, united workers can reclaim power and reshape society because the forces that dominate modern life, capital, institutions, political structures, and ideological systems are designed to maintain the authority of a minority over the vast majority. Individually, workers possess strength, skill, intelligence, and creative capacity. But capitalism fragments these capacities, scattering workers across workplaces, industries, and social divides so they cannot recognize how powerful they truly are. When isolated, each worker feels small, replaceable, dependent on wages, and vulnerable to the threats of unemployment or poverty. But this sense of powerlessness is not inherent, it is manufactured. The same system that extracts value from workers invests enormous effort in ensuring they never combine their forces. But once workers overcome this fragmentation, once they see themselves as a collective body rather than as scattered individuals, they reveal a truth that the ruling class has always feared. The entire structure of society rests on their labor, and without their consent and cooperation, nothing functions. Organization is the process through which this scattered potential becomes conscious power. Without organization, the efforts of workers remain scattered, arising in local struggles that can be exploited, suppressed, or absorbed by the system. But when workers organize, they create structures, unions, councils, associations, movements that allow them to coordinate their actions, articulate their demands, and confront the ruling class not as isolated individuals but as a unified force. Organization builds discipline, clarity, and strategy, turning frustration into purposeful action. It transforms the awareness of exploitation into the capacity to challenge the conditions that cause it. Through organization, workers learn to negotiate collectively, to defend one another, and to assert their rights in workplaces and beyond. They gain the ability to push back against the pressures that capitalism imposes on them and to claim space in the social order that has long denied them influence. Unity deepens and amplifies this organized power. Workers may understand their exploitation individually, but unity requires that they understand it collectively. Unity is not merely the absence of conflict among workers. It is the active recognition that their interests are shared and that their liberation depends on one another. In a system that thrives on division, unity is revolutionary. Capitalism encourages competition between workers, between departments, industries, nationalities, and identities to keep them divided and distracted. But unity allows workers to overcome these artificial boundaries and see the underlying truth. Regardless of their specific job or location, they are bound together by a common relation to capital. Their struggles are interconnected, and their goals can only be achieved together. When workers stand united, the techniques of division lose their force, and the system's ability to manipulate differences weakens. Through unity and organization, workers gain the power to challenge not just individual employers or policies, but the broader structures that shape society. They begin to question why decisions about production, distribution, and social priorities are made by those who contribute least to the actual creation of wealth. They begin to imagine a world where production serves social needs rather than private profit, where democratic participation extends into economic life, and where the collective effort of millions determines the direction of society. Organized workers can influence political systems, reshape public institutions, and demand accountability from those who wield authority. They can fight for wages, rights, and protections, but more importantly, they can push for structural transformations that redefine how society functions. Reclaiming power does not mean seizing authority through force. It means dismantling the arrangements that concentrate power in the hands of a few and returning it to the majority whose labor sustains every facet of social life. Through collective action strikes, negotiations, mass mobilization, public campaigns, and democratic engagement, workers can reshape the institutions that govern them. They can confront unjust laws, demand social protections, and insist on economic democracy. They can replace systems built on exploitation with systems built on cooperation, equality, and shared prosperity. But none of this is possible through individual effort alone. The isolated worker remains vulnerable. The united working class becomes a force capable of shaping history. Society is not an unchangeable machine. It is a human creation sustained by human labor. Those who produce the wealth of the world hold the latent power to reorganize it according to collective needs. Only when workers unite across workplaces, industries, and borders can they confront the structural injustices that capitalism normalizes. Only through organization can they coordinate their power into a force strong enough to challenge entrenched interests. And only through unity can they transform their shared suffering into a shared movement that redefines the future, proving that the destiny of society belongs not to the few who own, but to the many who create. When we trace the chains that bind the worker from exploitation to alienation, from division to powerlessness, we see that none of these conditions arise naturally. They are constructed, maintained, and enforced by a system that fears the awakening of those who make the world run. But we have also uncovered the truth that cuts through every deception. The machinery of control survives only as long as workers remain unaware of their collective strength. The moment we recognize that our struggles are shared, that our suffering is systemic, and that our power lies in unity and organization, the gears of exploitation begin to grind against themselves. For every product is forged by our hands, every industry stands on our labor, and every structure of power is upheld by our obedience. The future will not be gifted by those who profit from the present. It will be built by those who refuse to remain tools in a system designed to diminish them. When workers rise together, conscious of their purpose and organized in their struggle, they do more than challenge the world as it is, they create the world as it should be.